Welcome to the Boma Global series on innovation, entrepreneurship, and breakthroughs. I'm Ralph Talmont, and this is the Boma Poland studio. Technologies are always extensions of ourselves, or have been, except now we are seeing the emergence of technology so powerful that it can alter those perceptions and those actions. The simplistic science fiction idea of AI is that it's a benevolent or evil force that somehow rules society. But since it's technology, then someone was in charge of building it in the first place. A few steps need to be taken between now and then. And we are now in the process of taking those steps. Some of our more prominent science fiction is built with the brilliant insight that the future has a past, and it is usually a mess. The Matrix, the Terminator, Blade Runner, all rest on the realization that we are the past to an unknown future. And the fact is, we have an incomplete image of what AI actually is. To help us unravel some of those knotty issues surrounding our relationship with AI, or should we say its relationship with us, we have asked into the Boma studio today one of the global leaders working at the point where human ethics meet technology. John Havens is the Executive Director of the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics of Autonomous and Intelligent Systems, and a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Human Rights and Technology. And he is also the author of Artificial Intelligence, Embracing Our Humanity to Maximize Machines. John, welcome to our Boma.
My pleasure, Ralph. Thanks for having me.
To begin with, can we perhaps define some of the subtle yet rather important differences between the concepts that keep flying around, and they're of course related, but the concepts of machine learning, neural networks, and the very idea of artificial intelligence. How are they related?
It's a big question, defining artificial intelligence. I'll use a kind of our shorthand with the work that I help lead. First of all is artificial intelligence, that phrase is so big. It's kind of like saying the internet for me and for a lot of us now. It's whether it's simple machine learning or, to your point, deep learning or inverse reinforcement learning, neural networks, all that stuff. There's so much that people put in that bucket. We tend to use two different phrases. One is we'll say autonomous and intelligent systems. And the sort of delineation between that is intelligence is usually if there's what one would call a learning algorithm, although we try to avoid anthropomorphic terms, but something that evolves as compared to autonomous tech, which we're already used to in our lives with, something as simple when you drive as, pushing the button and the car stays at the same speed. We also have been using, as of late, the term artificial intelligence systems. And then in that way, it sort of encompasses everything, but it makes the point about systems, because often a lot of these technologies don't live in isolation. They are attached to each other in different ways through algorithms. So I sort of answered your question. I sort of didn't, but I'll pause there and hopefully that made sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. Perhaps as a follow-on from those distinctions, how is artificial intelligence augmenting and enhancing human intelligence already?
It's a big question. So I guess from a framing standpoint, is something as, quote, simple as a smartphone that we all have, simple forms of machine learning or online, bots, chat bots like with banking are pretty common right now. So in terms of assisting our lives, and this is if people have access to the internet, and only 50% of the world does and all that. But the point is that we're getting used to seeing these tools in our lives and not necessarily recognizing them as, artificial intelligence. We just know I went to my bank online and they had a, something I guess is called a chat bot, and I began interacting with it. So I think depending on, again, your access to these different tools, it's already, or voice assistance is another big one, whether it's Alexa, physical, box, or on your phone, like a Siri. If you have access to these tools, I don't know many people who wouldn't at least know what the term Alexa or Siri are. You asked about augmenting our intelligence. I think there I prefer the term informing the data around our lives. Intelligence, the English word, can mean a lot of things. For me, it doesn't necessarily mean sort of wisdom. It means there's information where these tools are amazing to get them to us, but then how our data is accessed and the insights that sort of come back into our lives. I like to separate that and say, well, wisdom really comes from the person in the context of how these things are interpreted.
You went through liberal arts education, and you're a very fine blues musician. I know, I've heard you play.
Thank you.
So naturally, of course, you work with advanced technology. Perhaps that question of search for wisdom and looking in a field that is moving so fast and affecting so many things, those things are certainly related, are they not?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked. And I know we've had talks about this before, and your perspective and the work of Boma, which I respect a great deal. There's this sort of systems thinking, right? I think it can be easy, and I'm a geek, and I say that with respect, right? Geeks can be...
Geek is a compliment.
Geek's a compliment. And I think what that means is this, at least for me, I'll say for myself, this curiosity, right? Which I love. I find curiosity very attractive in the sense of, I think there's a humility that comes with it, right? I think what happens is, for myself, you get a new piece of technology, or certainly when you're making it and you invest so much in it, there's sort of this assumption like this is going to work for everybody. And so the intentions oftentimes are very positive. But I think it's equivalent to like saying you found a new band, right? Like, I love this new band, right? And maybe like I love blues, as you pointed out. I might play a song to someone and they just don't like blues. It's not that they hate me or that the band is poorly put together.
They just don't dig blues.
They just don't like blues. So I think one thing, there's another project that we're working on with MIT called the Council on Extended Intelligence. And there we focus a lot on systems thinking. And this is like Donella Meadows, famous Donella Meadows. And also we're blessed, if that's the right term, to work with a lot of indigenous thinkers or people from indigenous traditions who are great thinkers in the space as well. And there, this sort of understanding of a connection, for instance, and I'm saying, by the way, indigenous traditions, there are hundreds and thousands of them around the world. So I'm being very general. But this connection to the environment that, for me in the West, I didn't really have growing up. I sort of picture like, hey, there's nature. I'm looking, talking with Ralph, and outside my window, I see that tree that I love. Or I'm aware that I have to do certain things to try to protect the environment. Where when you actually consider this real symbiosis with nature, there's much more kind of direct connection. Similarly, like when you hear music and it affects you somehow, or for people who are from faith-based traditions, all these things are to say that there's this ephemera or the spirituality, or if it's music, there's this sort of vibe, for lack of a better term, that is actually real. The sense of how your body physiologically responds to music.
These objects are actors in people's lives. They're not the background. Exactly.
And there's the sort of sense, I think sometimes, I know I had it before I got into AI and stuff, that you pick this up and it takes on a sort of content mindset and sort of its own entity kind of mindset, which in one sense is good if it helps you really ask questions about your own values and data protection. It can be a challenge if it, like you mentioned earlier, automatically means that you frame it from just fear or just utopia.
In your talks and in your writing, you often utter utterly human concepts. Kindness, for instance. How does kindness figure into the cold and calculating world of bits and bytes and shining, gleaming servers in racks in a data center somewhere? Because it has to, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I guess for me, I'll start with things that are simple for myself, and I appreciate your bringing this up. The last 8 or 9 months before COVID, something in my own life happened that brought about the most intense grief I've ever had, more than when my dad died. And because of the nature of the situation, which I won't go into graphics on, but there was so much need for self-kindness as well as trying to be kind to others, and self-kindness sort of like a, how did I get here? And I think with COVID, I'm seeing, as I'm sure you are too, around the world, mental health is at such a big, it's a real turning point in one sense that we can't ignore mental health, and we can't, ignore issues of depression or grief. And what I'm learning about kindness is, at least for me, self-kindness is not a self-forgiveness, right? They're distinct. It's not a, hey, everything I did, whatever, let's move on. It's more this sort of like deep sort of sense of just pausing and saying, I don't really understand everything that's happening to myself and to the world. But step one, I'm going to kind of allow myself to be here, but then kindness to others. I think here, what I think there's such an opportunity, a glorious opportunity with technology in general, and especially with AI and policies around the world, is to sort of recognize how there is this very similar nature to all of us as humans, for instance, with COVID. And we're framing caregivers in the way that they should be framed, which is they are heroes because they are. And I think if we were to start to rethink how the world can move forward, where these amazing technologies, which are already helping, AI is helping in so many humanitarian ways, in so many ways with mental health, soldiers and PTSD, for instance. And to think, what would the application of these things be if a kind of key principle, maybe even the first, was kindness? And I don't know how that would translate into other languages, but kindness, first of all, you have to listen to the other person that you're dealing with. How do they know you're trying to be kind? How do they accept kindness? But the kindness that comes from caregiving that really seems to be sustaining humans and the environment seems to be a wonderful sort of exploration for all of us as individuals and larger organizations to say, for your question, what would kindness look like in the application of AI? And what I would love to see is discussions happening from that point. Because, I gave you my thoughts, but how others view that, it'd be really cool to see what that meant.
Life is messy. Humans are messy. Software doesn't like messy. We have software that makes sure that other software is not messy. How does AI handle ambiguity? Can it be taught to handle ambiguity? Does it just ask for more and more data points and then figures it out somehow in a way that we may not even be able to perceive?
Well, again, Ralph, these are good, big questions, man. So well done. I think one thing is I want to, if not challenge, reframe the word messy. Humans are messy, but here, I'll show you. I have this on my desk. I'll read it to you, but it's this little statement.
Okay.
In Japan, broken objects are often repaired with gold. The flaw is seen as a unique piece of the object's history, which adds to its beauty. Consider this when you feel broken, right? What I think humans are, it's a synonym for messy, but it's not necessarily pejorative, is complex, right? As are these amazing technologies, or at least certainly things like deep learning and et cetera, et cetera. I think a critical way to have, let's a couple things moving forward pragmatically. One is about data. A lot of times in AI conversations, we'll talk about privacy and GDPR and privacy by design, which are critical. I think more often we should be speaking about places like Estonia with their e-Estonia work, India and Aadhaar, and outside of centralized and decentralized and the specific things that may be challenges in both of those countries, because of course there's always going to be challenges, anything can be hacked, et cetera, is to say, what's the opportunity? Where in Estonia, their e-Estonia work, a citizen, it's a citizen because it's tied to an identity scheme, so I'm the only John. They can access and share their data in what's called a sovereign data, peer-to-peer data exchange kind of mindset. This does not mean that they are not still interacting with businesses. This does not mean that they're not interacting with Estonia. Quite the opposite. They're actually interacting more, but they're doing it in a way where they have a knowledge of how precious their data actually is. And in the same way you would tell someone, hey, do you know how much money you have in your checking account and your savings account? It's the same logic here, but it's even more precious than money or specie. This is how your data is exchanged. So I bring all this up to say that right now, in terms of any system and its integration with humans, by and large, there's a tracking mindset where the disclosure aspect of how we share our data for the last 10 years and how the economics is set up is not made for actual good design, right? And by that, I mean, I so respect data scientists and engineers. I'm not one, and I have the blessing of working with IEEE. But if you have, say, two parts of a system, and one part of the system, you know exactly how it works, et cetera, but the other, it's not really that the humans are necessarily messy and all that. It's also that right now we don't have access to our data and can't share it. So we can be tracked, more than we would know. Like, I'm sure there's people tracking me and can tell me what I ate for the past 6 months, and I don't remember 3 days ago, right? And the analysis can be amazing. But first of all, I don't really have access to those things, and there may be thousands of algorithms tracking me. And secondly, there's going to come a point, I think we're already there, frankly, especially in virtual reality or gaming or augmented reality environments, where you can track John, me, to such a degree that if you want to sell me something, for instance, you may not even have to ask me because, well, John has done the same thing for the past 6 months. The probability is 99% he's going to get his, whatever, Starbucks coffee at 8 o'clock. But also when it comes to my subjective truth, and this has to do with how I would vote or aspects of my faith, or if someone is, for instance, gay, right? Who gets to say that someone is gay? Who gets to say that someone is a Muslim or a Jewish, right? Who gets to say that's the individual? Meaning you can track them and guess, I think that person's Christian because they walk into that building every Sunday. But maybe I'm a secretary at the church and I actually am an agnostic. When I go to vote in whatever country I'm in, and maybe me personally, I'm liberal and democratic, so I voted that way, sure. But maybe something's changed. And when I go to push my finger on a button and I want to change my mind, actual democracy and free will and agency means that I should know that mentally I can do that. So all that is to say, I talk about that for a while because it's critically important to recognize that unless we have access to and control of our data, then we'll lose agency. And then all these beautiful systems that we're building will not really serve the end user as they are intended because the end user won't really know who they are anymore.
We will have another layer of extractive economy imposed on the already existing layers of extractive economy, and we won't even realize that it's happening.
Yeah, and this is outside of negative actors or the negative economics. It's simply that we haven't been given those tools yet, and that's a lot of our work at IEEE and the work I help drive is giving like children's data rights to a sovereign level, employees, et cetera. It's a parity, it's a level set where then the people building the technology, where their intentions are good, right? We want to build things that are safe and all that, and it's really cool and geeky. They're speaking algorithmically in one sense to the end user when they write their code, right? Doing the best that they can to make something valuable for that person. But soon, what we're also have a new project on is trying to help people realize if the end user doesn't understand that they also have to be able to access their data and share sort of their terms and conditions at an algorithmic level, that first intersection is always then going to be biased in the sense of this amazing technology will start influencing that person's life in ways that the person isn't even realized, especially when the algorithms are invisible. That process where negative acting could happen is when people are trying to manipulate, right? Because people can be pretty easy to trick, right? Give them this offer at this time and they'll want to eat something because they're hungry at this time of day, right? And those things we have to be careful of, and that's managed with disclosure, et cetera. But when everybody knows all that stuff, it's still bad design if you don't allow the person to speak back and say, hey, listen, terms and conditions wise, I just changed something about myself. Now I'm a vegan, right? Think of that information. That person makes a decision that they're a vegan. That means that all the information about how they ate meat, how they went to certain supermarkets is going to change. That information to share with brands, think of the savings for brands. It's great. They'll go, oh, you're a vegan now. Well, we have these alternate meat options, right? So there's so much innovation opportunity and a chance for trust to be built when these tools are given to end users.
But that requires a certain change of mindset on the part of the designers of these tools. And also, it requires that we all ask ourselves the question of, do we all have to upskill in order to actually perceive the opportunities and actually work with these technologies in ways that are positive rather than not, and be able to tell the difference. How can we upskill?
You know, what's interesting is a device comes into your home, right? And let's say it's a voice assistant that can speak. Right now, you know, usually it's just you hear from a friend, hey, this is cool thing that you get, and you say, hey, name of product, what's the weather? And it talks back to you. And the paradigm of our life then changes. Right now in millions of homes, people are used to speaking to an object or their phone, hearing an actual voice back, right? A literal human sounding voice back. But what they don't realize, or maybe they do that just hasn't calculated at a deep level, is then that data by and large is shared to the cloud, interpreted in thousands of different ways. And then, you know, obviously something as simple as what's the weather, it's mainly about, does it give accurate predictions? But in terms of, you know, the other issues about how our values are challenged and all those things, what's interesting is those things just happened. And they happened because the focus was mainly on, you know, kind of move fast and break things and economics and all that, with really cool products. And the AI behind a lot of these things is stunning what it can do. Here, I think a big opportunity is to reframe like this type of conversation and know that it's not just about legal compliance, and it's not a stick question, you know, regulation. And it's also not for me in any way about saying anything negative about the technology. I often say AI or any technology is not positive or negative, but in the case of AI, it's also not inert. So here the opportunity is to say, and this is also a recognition for brands of any kind, if we don't start protecting human agency, then it's not just that, you know, a privacy or a you know, kind of a regulation question. It is literally that we'll lose our agency. We won't be able to make choices. And in terms of, let's say it's a negative kind of, I just want somebody to buy as much as they can and whatever, they won't be able to if they don't understand why they're making their choices.
If they don't understand that there are choices to be made.
Yeah, there's so many opportunities for disclosure, but not in just like legalese, through storytelling, through explanations. One person, I was reading a paper recently, in a smarter home, they had every different element of the home have a different voice. So the smart thermostat had like a male voice, and then the smart fridge had a female voice, and Siri had a different voice. And it was a wonderful example for me of a systems thinking mindset, where just those cues meant, first of all, it was better for the consumer or the user, because they'd go, oh, my thermostat is speaking and there's an emergency because my boiler just blew or whatever. But that from a paradigm teaching perspective, the buyer just thought, oh, this is cool. I can pick Darth Vader for this voice and Yoda for that voice. But what the designer knew beautifully is we have to show them how this all works together. And by the way, I don't know if there's a series of Star Wars voices for your house, but if there is, then I want it.
But coming back to the question of in a way, sticking up for our own agency, that requires learning. And in order to learn, we have to first be conscious and aware that such a thing exists and it has its limits. or borders, and those borders are being infringed upon, not because those who are infringing are necessarily evil, but this is just a natural progression of we have infringed to this far. Well, tomorrow we will infringe that far just because this is how things progress. Have you seen any examples around the world anywhere where there have been successful efforts to educate the general population, or those who wanted to listen, as to the need for such consciousness and awareness, and then the need for maybe a few simple lessons to figure out how to deal with this stuff? Is anybody doing this?
Well, there's a guy, I have his paper right here. He knows I've read this paper and it blew my mind. It's called Rise of Machine Agency, a framework for studying the psychology of human AI interaction. And his name is Shyam Sundar. He's based at Penn State in the United States. I will not do justice to his work here, but he has this wonderful, you can't really see it, but it's this, I've marked it up, this framework. I'm going to interpret it very roughly. And this is an idea that we're working on now with other work that I'm driving, which is trust, right? A lot of your last question has to do with trust, even though you said, is someone doing this well? And to me, more and more, I'm realizing what I can, not me, John, but what one can provide is tools for agency that then will lead to trust when it's earned. So I'll give you the example of you and me in this thing here. Like, let's say you and I weren't friends, but you were like, because we're friends and we know each other, but you were like, John, I heard about you. Can we do an interview, right? We would have this, I forget if we're using Skype or Zoom or what we're using, but we'd have this tool between us that is giving us agency to speak and hear each other. Then there's tools like, or not tools, but facts. I respect what Boma's doing, right? And you're with Boma. So I'd go, okay, I know who they are. There's these different sort of levels of agency, may not be the right word here, but like
credibility, I guess.
Well, like bridges where like the bridges are there and then you and I actually start to interact. When the communication, I'll call these communication paradigms that are communicating different ideas, which are, again, I'm not explaining this well, but so deep that they aren't necessarily given in words even, right? But then they're there. Now, in this example I just gave, you and I are talking. And at some point, trust begins. This beautiful moment of trust begins. Like, I'm like, Ralph's a great guy. These are great questions. I respect him as a professional interviewer. And then, it's a nice joke. I'd like to hang out with this guy. But agency in his paper, Sundar's paper, he also points out that AI or these different technologies are themselves content. Now, he doesn't mean the content of a certain media platform. He means that this, looking at this, and I completely agree with him, it's a talisman, as it were. It's an object that immediately changes the nature of the room. And he quotes Marshall McLuhan, which made me love the paper that much more, in terms of the medium is the message.
We're of that vintage
Yes.
that really appreciates Marshall McLuhan.
Exactly. We think that we're just interacting with a piece of technology. What we're actually doing is existing in the context of our cultural and values-based body in another level of cultures and values because of where we live, interacting with someone else with their culture and values through technology, which has all these issues of power and all this stuff. Anyway, his paper, which I love, is about saying when we can have the end user be able to really interact and communicate and give back their thoughts about their values and whatever to a sort of an algorithm, right? Which is not a person, but in the sense of there's an introduction of an algorithm that's going to be affecting them and their data. Why not? Here's the opportunity. Give a person ways that they can interact with it. And I gave that example of multiple, that's his example, is the multiple objects in a house that have different voices, because it empowers the person to actually be able to sort of say, oh, I didn't know that you could have different voices for these objects. And if the designer is smart, they'll say, well, this is not just because it's fun. This is because then you can understand these are separate items that are working together at a systems level. And then here's why this helps you. If one voice changes, then that's not working, and you call the repairman or whatever. Anyway, his paper is just fantastic. And the opportunity that I think through data sovereignty and through these really smart tools that we start knowing us end users, we can be empowered to communicate, by the way, in ways that will only seismically help AI designers and creators, because it's what's called participatory design, or in the UK, they really created RRI, responsible research and innovation, values-driven design. It simply means that you're not actually just listening through surveys, which are great, to how people are reacting to something you've already built, right? Well, here it is. What do you think about it? It's from the design phase saying, we're going to build this. Here's maybe a test prototype, but now here are these ways that we're going to communicate with you so that you're actually part of the production process. Person feels empowered. They're sharing their data in a safe way. Now the insights they give are absolutely unique about just John or about just Ralph. And that goes back to the designers in an aggregate. Now, this is where I think trust can really start to really, really happen, because now I'll know, hey, I was part of building this new version of an iPhone or whatever. I actually helped do this and I gave feedback. And when I can see that the producer, and I don't mean Apple here, I mean whoever, took the time to do all this with me, now I can really trust them because they may be part of the process.
It's a question of intention too, really, at a deep level. We'll have to get you back into the Boma for another series of programs we're doing titled Create to Sustain. And they are actually focused on design and the creative industries and how they interact with our relationship with the future with capital T and capital F. But that's for another time. But what we're really seeing is that we can't afford to treat AI as merely yet another technological advancement, can we?
No, I think there's two things. One is people will say, well, AI is just the latest technology. And I say this all the time. It's simply not. Meaning, like, I was on a call and someone's like, why do we care about the values of AI or something versus the values of a road? And like I said a minute ago, it's because where human data is tracked and environmental data, et cetera, and goes to the cloud, right? The presence of the cloud is new, period. The presence of the system that says when we track the humans, mainly the people creating or the brands or the organizations that are creating the objects or the tools or the social networks to access that data, have intellectual property and sort of walled gates about how they access the data, but then the user kind of can't. These are all things that are new. And so to not address them and just sort of blithely say, AI is the newest thing, it's simply just inaccurate. And that's even before recognizing all the different levels of like you already said, machine learning versus deep learning. These are all really different approaches, neural networks, about how to access insights around the human condition. And there's also the big thing I wrote about in my book, and thank you for mentioning it. And I have it right here, artificial intelligence. Thank you.
You've seen it now. You go out and get it.
Well, you're very kind. Is that humans, what a wonderful opportunity to know ourselves better. My main question in the book is, how will machines, where did I put it? How will I can't believe I forgot it. Oh yeah, how will machines know what we value if we don't know ourselves? And it's intended to be a pun, meaning we can sometimes, I think too easily, and I'll say blame, but there's also a bias, right? Machine, like a negative bias towards machines, not AI. A machine fails once and you're like, well, this machine is horrible.
Useless.
Right?
Yeah.
But what a great time to ask, what are my values? If you have terms and conditions for your own life that you would want to be honored at an algorithmic level.
That requires major levels of self-awareness, doesn't it?
It does, but one thing that's exciting, sorry, I'm just moving something, is especially now with COVID and what have you, mental health is not just about mental illness, right? A lot of my book, I talk about positive psychology, and really a lot of that's, let's call it common sense. You know, things like being around family and supportive friends. This can improve your well-being. Shocker, right?
This pun that you just mentioned is a wonderful thing, because there is a concept that's been making the rounds increasingly in specialist circles, but it has been, of AI for social good, which is a wonderful thing. But then if you think about it, it is a concept that's wrapped up in inherent intrinsic difficulty of definition and execution. What is social good? Whose definition are we listening to? And how are we even going to train any kind of machine to distinguish what is social good? And then how do we train it to help us turn this into policy? That's the level of difficulty that we are actually facing with AI as a whole going forward, isn't it?
Yes. And again, great question. We just released a recommended practice. It's a standard, but there's different levels of a standard. So it's technically a standard from IEEE, global standard, focused on well-being indicators and technology. So what that means is, without realizing it, our lives are dictated in one sense by GDP. And I want to be clear, this doesn't mean that GDP is evil, right?
No, GDP is inadequate, that's all.
It's inadequate. Great. Exactly. Great way to put it. It was, created 70 or 80 years ago, largely as a metric to understand economics during wartime. But it wasn't built to measure things like caregiving, and caregiving is largely done by women and educators around the world.
So they're outside of the spreadsheet.
Yeah, they're not seen, they're not measured. And the same thing with the environment. It wasn't the main priority. Also, in general, GDP statistics tend to be done once a quarter, maybe once a year, looking backwards. And again, like it's just a measure, right? But like if an oil tanker runs into an island or something, the GDP will go up that year because more jobs may be created to get rid of the oil, or the GDP goes up in a traffic jam because there's more gas being used. But most people wouldn't say human well-being is increased in a traffic jam, right? So there's this mindset of like a systems thinking, which when we think about what are the metrics for success and how do we measure them, you would never build a tool as an engineer or a data scientist where you only looked at sort of, if there were three main buckets of risk, for instance, you wouldn't go, let's look at this one bucket and not worry about the others, right? It's a holistic understanding of, do we know how to avoid risk? And there's this whole, we have another standard focus on that type of work. Here, in terms of societal good, or you'll hear about AI for good, and you already kind of nailed this, where good for who, right? And especially when I get to hang out with my formal ethicist or philosopher friends, that's a good time. Like, what does a good society even mean? And this is where, in the West, usually we go to the Greeks and talk about phronesis and Aristotle, and that's a great conversation. My friends in China and the East, you talk about Confucian thought or Taoist thought. Global South, you talk about Ubuntu ethics from Africa, Japan, Shinto, and that's before all the great isn't even the right word, but incredibly rich, diverse indigenous traditions. All of these framings are how people live their lives and their values, and that's even before, say, the bias of me being male or me being American. Right? Recognizing these things, what we've done in the standard is to say, look, there's indicators that measure more than just exponential growth. And people know things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals or OECD's Better Life Index, or they may have heard of Bhutan's gross national happiness and then usually kind of laugh it off going, happiness, how do you measure?
They're up in the hills somewhere, far away from the world. They can afford it, right?
Right. And if you actually look at what they've done, because the gross national happiness metrics are what really inspired the rest of the world to create these other metrics, how they've changed their environmental standards, meaning their ESG reporting, and what they actually do is astounding. right? And how they've changed aspects of well-being for their citizens is astounding. Now, are there other issues in Bhutan, like any country, that are still challenging? Yeah, but the point is that's not the point, right? Don't look at Bhutan or OECD and only say, well, here's the things that are wrong. What they're doing is they're measuring more than just one thing as societal success. So our work with this standard, and we have a well-being committee, is the simple way of calling it is the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. If in any organization, business, or policy, we actually can say at the same level, this is what's critical, at the same level that we measure money and monetary and financial issues, right, which everyone kind of is doing consistently, we start to measure the environment and things like mental health and well-being. And they aren't just measured the same, it's in unison. Those three things in unison, that's defined as societal health. Then that's where we at least have a shot to have sustainability for human well-being and the environment, and massive opportunities for innovation for how we build these glorious tools. I say this all the time, but like autonomous vehicles, it's a much different question if you're building an autonomous vehicle in a smarter city setting, to say, am I building the really smart, AV? It's not going to hurt people. It gets good mileage, whatever else, all important things. But then when you look at like the Happy Planet Index out of the UK, or certain of the SDGs, and see about environmental aspects, and you realize how much green space is going to come back to a city, and then how green space, for instance, over and over, Gallup and so many other global groups that measure human well-being, green space literally heals people. It's measured, period. If people are like, oh, you can't measure well-being, the answer is, yes, you can. There's empirical scientific data measuring human physiology through things like apps and galvanic skin temperature and sweat and all that stuff, and all the geeky fun stuff, where the second there's green space, it calms people down. On a spreadsheet, this means you can save money, where you actually say, well, let's put 1,000, once they're safe and all that, AVs, and we can start removing parking lots. And there's the revenue for the parking lots and the jobs, which you can ask about and weigh one against the other. But say, well, maybe, we reskill whatever with those jobs. But the green space alone means that aggregate, we can see how much money savings there will be for medical. And by the way, the UN World Happiness Report, people like Jeffrey Sachs and John Halliwell for the last 3 years have also come out with a policy-based report, which is very, very pragmatic and very, very technology-driven. And it's really incredible to see with this multiple lens mindset how innovation grows so quickly. The challenge is that it's easy to only measure, not easy, but it's easier to say, well, let's just stick with GDP. But the answer is, unless you are saying these other things are important and here's how we can measure them, then you're never going to prioritize them.
While we have in every industry, in every country, been preoccupied with COVID-19 over the last weeks and months, the far greater and imminent threat of man-made climate change has not gone away. Can AI help us fight that particular monster?
Oh, big time. Yeah, there's already been a lot of great work, certainly with like meteorology, measuring hurricanes and humanitarian efforts, where machine learning and different aspects of how to get resources to the right place fast. The other thing, which we have a report about this, I'll send you the link to it. And it's, we worked with an amazing guy, me and a guy named Konstantinos Karahalios, who's the managing director of the IEEE Standards Association, wrote a paper with Lord Nicholas Stern, who is a real expert on the sustainability side of things. One thing that most people tend to forget about the environment is how much of, especially cities, how many cities around the world, in the West, in quote, rich nations, I hate these terms, but first world, I don't like these classifications, but the point being, in Western locations, for instance, Miami, right? Infrastructure, the physical infrastructure of cities. This is not about smarter cities and sensors, like, the walls, the seawalls blocking water from coming over and killing people, are at such a disarray There's this wonderful systems thinking that he talks about in his paper, which we mentioned in our paper, and I'll send you the link, of understanding this sort of like giving people more jobs, fixing infrastructure now, using AI, machine learning, et cetera. Probabilistic computing is a new sort of strain of this as well, of AI, to sort of say, like, what are the decisions that we make now, which are going to cost a lot of money? But as he points out in his report, it's very scary to look at like Miami and say, we need whatever it is, I'm making this number up, $1 trillion right now. That's a huge number. But if you wait even like 6 months or a year, that's exponential. It's not like, well, it's only going to be $1 trillion, trillion, 1 billion. It's going to be like 3 trillion. And this is after lives are lost. So this is where also it's a wonderful opportunity to say, if we're going to stay with the status quo and think about just the financial metrics, we will not literally save people's lives. And we will not save, like Miami, I think, I forget what it is. It's like 15 years or something, 20 years from being more underwater than it already is. But if there's a seawall that is threatening to the
cave,
cave, then you got to fix it. And now then putting in sensors in those infrastructure rebuilds. There's this great opportunity for kind of a triple win, right? You use the technology in the best way possible. You change infrastructure and give people jobs, and you do it where an ultimate goal here is not about the money as much as it is making sure the environment is flourishing.
So what you're actually, the picture you're painting is of a very broad scientific and business community using highly sophisticated tools to map and forecast events, occurrences, and to draw conclusions and build policy and also build business plans based on those conclusions. I
should mention, hey, before I forget, my friend Amy Luers, Luers. Amy is a global thought leader, and we have a committee focused on sustainability issues. Amy is the executive director of a group called Future Earth, and they have something called Sustainability in the Digital Age, where we're really working together now, and IEEE is doing all this other stuff. I just want to say yes and to what you just said, trying to make it pragmatic too, and also start committing to not just from the sense of like, hey, save the planet, let's hold hands and save the planet. It's like, nope, this is actual what, quote, good design is not even the word anymore. It's sustainable design, meaning how does the planet and how do people stay around? So it's not even, we don't have to call it good, yay, it's good. It's like, no, it's essential. Or pick your
Kumbaya is not going to cut it. We're talking serious spade work. And that is a very positive image. There are other possible, more or less likely scenarios. How likely do you think are we, the collective we, the societal we, to not realize that we are at a point of a real decision that is going to affect not just us for the next 2 or 3 years, but is going to affect the next generation and the next generation, simply because technology, once it is pointed in the general direction, it continues to develop in that general direction. And perhaps some of the unintended consequences of that development will stem from the technology not being sufficiently intelligently designed at the very start, i.e. today. So we're at this moment where it's a crossroads, and both roads, as in the Robert Frost poem, look equally attractive in their own ways. Which road we take will govern the quality of our lives and the lives of our children and the lives of our children's children. This decision is so momentous, yet the discussion about AI is so often brought down to a very simplistic level of somewhere between hype, PR, and science fiction. Now, you and your organization are doing an awful lot of work to bring some kind of level of sanity to that discussion, and also to make that discussion broader. But should this discussion not be part of, primary, secondary school curriculum everywhere?
Well, it's a great question. I don't want to be angry anymore. It's very easy to be angry and scared and resentful and bitter about like how things sort of exist. And it's also ironic because I'm in a beautiful house in the suburbs of New Jersey. I have enough food to eat. I don't want to sound hypocritical, right? In terms of, or if I know I am, I guess I should say. Nonetheless, I think, the status quo, meaning just how the world looks right now. I think sometimes people think it's just the way it is and it's going to never change. So there are many days I wake up and I'm depressed. I'm like, I don't know how that's going to change. Then there are other days where, especially in the midst of COVID, there's been such an amazing outpouring of love and care in the midst of chaos and sadly sometimes death. So not to sound morbid, but I was also in New York when 9/11 happened. I was actually in Manhattan. And one aspect of that horrible day and that time was the stripping away of this sort of veil, I think, that we all have, or at least, most humans. I don't want to speak for everyone, obviously, but I'll just speak for the context of living in the New York kind of metropolitan area. It was this beautiful time in its horror of people really caring about each other. We were all scared in 9/11, and I think we're here now. We don't know what's going to happen. But one thing I think is easy to see is the status quo that we had before, where, especially with things, I'll talk about mental health again, there's this real understanding now of how many people are, I'll start with the not negative, but the fact, right? Sad, depressed, really, really, really struggling. And there's just as much focus on these amazing, beautiful caregivers and the opportunity for all of us to say, you know what? Most of us, all of us are empowered to be kind. And these actions can actually then be reflected in the measurements that we say are valuable. For instance, caregivers, not just the medical aspects of it, but people who can walk over and emotionally stand 6 feet away from someone who's been sequestered, through a window, tap on the window and have a conversation with that person. They can literally mitigate depression. That's all they need to do, is walk over and talk to them. Because that action is not valued in either financial statistics or people, framing it as like, well, that's a nice thing to do. And we haven't sort of asked in the current status quo, well, how could that actual action, and many organizations are doing this, by the way, volunteership, et cetera, actually be a way that we move forward? The answer is it could be. And there are also things like, that I just don't understand. Things like, tax havens, right? Where certain organizations may have tax havens and not pay aspects of that money, which if they did, it could really help a lot of other people. I think there's this fear about change, and there's this fear, which I get, if I have enough money or stuff, I'll be safe. And I get it. I'm tired of being angry. But now, with the caregiving and with all these needs for jobs and with health where it is, what an awesome opportunity for people to make history. Billionaires, whoever, to literally change how they do business and encourage their businesses to change. Otherwise, I don't see anything except the status quo kind of statistics of where we are now doing anything but accelerating. The emissions, my sky around New Jersey is so much clearer the last couple of months. If we go back to status quo, and by the way, I'm not
traffic out of Newark. Yeah.
I don't want airlines to be out of work. I don't want those people to be out of work. So we have to figure out what can help them do that. I love traveling. I'm going to miss some of that, but I need to change my life, or I go back to my status quo. Mm-hmm. So long answer, except to say, it's a huge reflection point for humanity, where I think AI as a technology is helping us, among all of its other great benefits, to really say, what is the human story we want moving forward? The technology can serve what the metrics are of success that we want to hit. And I think the actual real danger is to say, let's use these amazing technologies to grow even faster, exponential growth.
And it will do that very efficiently.
Because that's why they're built.
Yeah.
But to be negative towards human capabilities, or to certainly not prioritize the environment, simply means then as humans, we're saying we don't really want to have sustainability of humans in the environment. We want to, probably for a very small group of people, accelerate growth or wealth or whatever. And I'm hoping, it's a very huge understatement. This is a wonderful reflection time for so many different actors and people in groups in society, like the work you're doing with Boma, to say, hey, we actually don't have to, this is not in stone, right? How we measure things, GDP, these were things that were created before. Now they need to evolve. That's all. It doesn't have to be condemning somebody or saying someone's evil. It's simply saying, what do we want to prioritize? And then actually prioritizing those things.
We're a smart species. We invent tools. And when the tools we have become inadequate, we invent new tools in their place. So some kind of technologically enabled dystopian economic feudalism, some kind of a dreadful version of the Matrix, is not inevitable.
Nope. We can have a world led by well-being. And by the way, I should say New Zealand before we end, because I know we're about to end, but look to New Zealand. It's a very specific country, but they have a well-being budget in 2019. It's got financial metrics, boom, but it also has education metrics, it has mental health metrics and environmental metrics. And the message there is all of these things in unison are what they're prioritizing. And their AI roadmap, success for AI, is achieving the well-being budget. Beautiful, beautiful testament to exactly what me, John, and a lot of our work in the initiative that I drive is focused on, which is to say, they're defining well-being for their country, but AI is serving the holistic integration of multiple indicators of success, not just financial. So New Zealand, by the way, when people are like, this will never happen. Well, New Zealand is making an amazing precedent. And then countries like the UK, I mentioned Bhutan, all these other countries in the States, there's something called the Social Progress Index, the Genuine Progress Indicator, things like they have a formula to measure caregiving. These things already actually exist. We just have to allow our brains to say, wait a second, we can shift a paradigm that was started 70 or 80 years ago with the GDP, for instance, and really use these technologies, not just to say we want to do good and create something cool and go in the existing status quo, because that good may be not as good as it could be, or it won't be, because the good is still going to be mainly valued with this one lens over here, versus if the answer is, instead of good, can it provably increase human well-being with existing metrics and environmental sustainability? And any AI that's built, is that part of the success metric? Of course, and you have to make enough money to make a profit, which you should. But those three things in unison, that is success for AI and for humans moving forward. It's not easy. And by success, I don't mean that it automatically is utopia and everything works, but it's how everything needs to be built, or it will only be built as it has been status quo.
Thank you very much indeed for contributing to this very important discussion. My name is Ralph Talmont. This has been a Boma, Poland studio production. Thank you again, John Havens, and a big thanks to the rest of the Boma, Poland team, Filiberto Amati, Alexandra Dudek, Mikołaj Wałęczak, and Zuzana Lewandowska. Keep an eye out on our social channels and our web, pl.boma.global. We will post the links to the documents that John has mentioned in the interview. And keep an eye out for more similar programs coming up very soon. Thank you, and it's goodbye from Warsaw.